Today I'm going to be taking a look at one of the newer releases from the Nomos Club Campus range. Just to note, this watch was sent to me by Nomos themselves. I got it for about a week and then I had to return it, so appreciate the borrow. Nomos didn't have any oversight into what I said in the video. They didn't have to review the video, so these are all my thoughts. I just thankfully didn't have to pay for the watch. Just as a note, I did get the green version for myself. This was not sent by Nomos, so if you want to see a review of that one, I might do like a little quick 5-minute review since I've reviewed the Club Campus in so many variations so many times. So let me know if that's interesting to you, and let's get into this video. So we have a diameter of 36, lug to lug of 46, height of 8.1, and a lug width of 18 millimeters. Some other general specifications for this watch: we're going to have the in-house caliber alpha from Nomos through this closed case back. You can opt for a sapphire case back for an extra $300. This watch has a very gently domed and kind of box-shaped sapphire crystal. We have super luminova for all the lume, which all glows blue on the hands and indices. We have 100 meters of stated water resistance with a regular push-pull crown. This is a hand-wound watch as well. I don't see anywhere where they state whether or not they use an AR coating, but as it stands, it's not overly reflective, so no problems there. And last but not least, this watch retails directly from Nomos for $1,500 in this variation, or like I mentioned, $1,800 for the sapphire case back. So moving on to the dial of this watch, and I think this is probably the best part about it. Nomos, and especially the Nomos Club range, has had a lot of fun with color and just being a little bit more daring than most companies do. For this watch in particular, they went for, I believe they call it cream coral or something of that kind of name online. I'll correct it somewhere at the bottom here. And it's a beautiful shade of this nice orange, kind of reminds me of like an orange creamsicle type color. And almost all the Nomos clubs, at least in my memory, use this bright orange seconds hand. And because it has this orange color to the base of the dial, this is one of the first clubs where I found that I don't mind that orange seconds hand. It blends in very perfectly with the color tones. It blends in really nicely with the design language. And even though I'm not the biggest fan of orange, because this creamier orange is such a pleasing color, at least in my opinion, it makes it much more manageable for being an orange color, and it's something I would wear. Looking a little bit more generally, we do see Nomos does this Kali style dial with the Arabic numerals at top and then the Roman numerals at bottom. Again, this is also one of those first ones where I don't overly notice that style of numeral set, basically. It's not something that pops out super apparently to me. All the tones blend in really well, so if you do focus on it, obviously you can see, well, they're not all Arabics, but it doesn't stand out too like egregiously or anything like that. We have rectangular markers between each of the numerals and then a seconds track along the outside, done in the same tone as everything else, with every 5-minute marker being denoted by the actual number 5, 10, 15, and so on. Something I will note is just the fact that the numerals do lean a little bit almost grayish instead of pure white, whereas the hands are more of a pure white. I don't know if that's just the way the application of the lume is done, because they all glow the exact same color. So I don't quite know what aspect of that lume is making the hands and the indices mismatch a little bit. It is not overly apparent in direct light, but if you really focus hard, you can tell the hands are a little bit brighter. In theory, I guess that helps with legibility, but I would have preferred to see a nice uniform color tone all around, because the actual seconds track is that more pure white in comparison to the numerals here. And one thing you might not notice until we zoom in is each numeral has a faint outline of blue around it. And I don't know if that just helps with contrast, makes it feel deeper than it actually is. It's kind of some kind of color theory type of thing, but it exists. It's not overly noticeable to me, and I don't mind it. I like that they kept the text very minimal here, just Nomos Glashütte at the very top, made in Germany, in very small lettering down here near the 30-second mark, or 30-minute mark really. And I do just enjoy how in the sub-seconds here, not only is it indented into the dial, it adds some depth to the otherwise relatively flat dial, but you also have the 60, 20, and 40 marked out there. It just makes it feel less sparse. It feels a little bit more sporty because of that, and it doesn't feel overboard with the text that's on the dial, which I think is really well executed here. It's one of those things where they could have definitely gone overboard, but they had a nice balance between having stuff on the dial and still making it feel relatively not too empty and not too full. And then before we move on, pretty classic pencil style handset from Nomos here, Lume infilled. They seem to be done pretty well. I almost would have preferred them done in kind of a white lacquer, but as it stands, I guess it helps with legibility. It ties in with the actual stainless steel of the case, so I'm not too mad at it, and I don't mind it as it's executed. So taking a look at the watch in natural light, we can see it takes on this beautiful uniform orange color, just very nice in the shade, more kind of case popping than it does in direct sunlight. You can kind of see it goes blacker, and the dial thankfully doesn't really change in saturation. It stays that same orange almost all the time, except at some extreme angles it has a slight color shift, but it is a very consistent and beautiful color no matter the lighting. This kind of view I really like because it's kind of shaded, kind of in direct sunlight, and you can see, again, it's a consistent dial color. The white tones pop a lot, the case really shines, and it is just a beautiful watch. And on wrist, again, 36mm size, fits great. The strap pairs with it, I think, beautifully, and it is just a color that, although stands out, isn't in your face. It really is an orange that's, I think, very wearable and looks great. So zooming in on the dial here, we can see some of these details that didn't really come to life on the wrist or from a little bit further away view. We can see we have this kind of pebbled eggshell type dried paint look to the dial surface itself. And what I really like about surfaces like this on dials is the fact that it helps absorb the light really well, and it doesn't really disperse it. It doesn't create these rainbow effects or this intense glare or this intense reflection. So it's a really good dial surface to just exist in a sense, and that is a kind of a weird way to put it, but basically it just lets the rest of the dial elements shine, and it doesn't get in the way of the color, it doesn't get in the way of the other elements on the dial, it doesn't overly make the dial reflective. It is just a nice base dial texture to work off and to complement the rest of the elements that are on the dial. We can see here the Nomos text is done in this similar font, this kind of sparkly white type texture. It doesn't seem overly flat. I'm assuming the text is printed over a couple different layers rather than just one, but I do think they should have gone over it a couple more times just to add a little bit more depth to it, especially since the numerals themselves are so three-dimensional and so bulbous by comparison. And at this magnification, you can see that kind of aquamarine, teal, bluish color that is surrounding each of those numerals, which is surprising because it's a relatively bright color, but from wrist view, you don't overly notice that. And a really nice detail here is that each 5-minute mark, again, it's written out in the numeral in the minutes track, but it's also written out in this kind of greenish, trying to be the same blue, but not quite the same blue that surrounds the numerals. And I think that's just a really fun touch. It's really not an aspect that Nomos had to do. It's not an aspect you really notice from wrist, but it's showing that they're going the extra mile and just doing design for design's sake. Having these fun little flares that honestly someone may never notice, but it adds to that overall package and interest of the watch. And it's one thing where if you own a loupe, for example, it's something you'll enjoy even more because you find out details you didn't know existed. One thing to note is the QC isn't perfect here. We do have this like black little speck on the dial. We have this square part of the marker that's kind of weaker towards the outside edge. If you look at the hands, you can see on that minute hand there's just that tiny little speck of that dust. But it is a relatively clean dial. There really aren't that many imperfections or anything that I would say stand out glaringly obviously. So although there's tiny little aspects that could be cleaner, as it stands, it's really not bad. Looking at the handset, we have a nice cap to the center pinion there, makes it feel very premium. Fully polished hands, of course. There's not really much shape to them. They just are, in a sense, two-dimensional. They're pretty flat. I would have liked to see maybe some beveling or some difference in finishing, but as it stands, they're really not badly done. They're simple, but they're executed well. One thing I do like is compared to some other hands that you can see, especially at this price point or a little bit lower, they're not as like jagged or rough or in a sense fuzzy, where you can see some really, I guess you can say, not perfectly cut hands, maybe not hands that are diamond cut in the same way. So it's nice to see that these are, again, simple but well executed. And then before we move on, I want to focus on one of my favorite aspects of this dial, which is the sub-seconds track. It just has this beautiful depth to it. It rounds out nicely going from the base surface to the actual lowered surface of the seconds track. It has this really nice fuzzy orange hand, which I think it would have been cool to do those hands, the main handset, maybe a white fuzzy type of application, and it would have looked more fun in a sense. But again, as it stands, printing is done well here. Hand is executed really well with the texture that, again, I've really never seen before from any other brand. And overall, we just have a pretty nice dial with a surprising amount of detail packed into a pretty small surface. So moving on to the case of this watch, and this is the classic Nomos Club case. You have a very circular mid case, about as circular as you can get, and these kind of pseudo welded on lugs in a sense that are fairly long. They do have a really large stance to them. They sit very flatly. Because the watch is so thin and you still do have a curvature to those lugs, it does wear well on wrist. It wears very svelte. But because they're so long for the size, like there's watches that are about 40 millimeter that had the same lug to lug range as this watch. So because that can create a gap in the lugs with the stock straps, it does look really good on one-piece straps in my opinion, but as it stands, it's either love it or hate it with the type of case profile, really. We do have a very simple, all high polished case here, even down to the case back. But something I really like and I always appreciate on these Nomos cases, not only is how thin and comfortable the watch wears, but the gentle domage that comes from this case. There's a very softly rounded bezel that leads into the crystal very nicely. It just has a beautiful, soft shape to it. There aren't any really harsh edges or sharp edges. Even at the very tip of the lug here, where it should be the sharpest, it's much less abrasive or sharp or unrefined than some other watches that are even more expensive than this. So it's nice to see them taking that extra mile and working on things that make the wearing experience very nice and very comfortable. You can see we have a relatively large crown, and this is a manual wind watch, so you're going to be interacting with the crown fairly often. It has good knurling, it's very easy to grip, the winding action itself is very smooth, really clicky, as you are turning gears. And it just is really nice action, really nice feel, and really can't complain too much about this aspect of the watch. The Nomos Alpha Caliber is nice to use. This is a movement feel that is more than acceptable at the price point, honestly better than a lot of watches out there and a lot of movements out there in terms of just how it feels operating. Again, beautifully thin mid case here, really not much going on the bezel or the case back. It really is just a mid case, which they take full advantage of that thinness of the Alpha Caliber and still somehow pack 100 meters of water resistance into this very small case, obviously with gaskets and stuff like that, but it's still impressive to do at this size. Like we saw earlier, really simple case back, and let's move on to how this case wears. So earlier I was wearing this other interesting micro brand Haim, really cool blue dial on this guy. So wearing this watch on my 6.5-inch wrist, you can see it fits pretty proportionally, and I do think the color tone is pretty beautiful. It has a really nice depth and warmth to it. But besides that, of course, the lugs are fairly long. Even though I can wear 36 millimeter watches pretty great all times of the day, this lug to lug is fairly long and it's almost already overhanging in a sense. I couldn't go and wear their 40 millimeter club, for example, because it's so much longer lug to lug. So that's just something to keep in mind just for personal style and personal preference. That being said, I do really like how the light catches on this case. It is polished well, a slight bit of domage on the bezel. It's just interesting. It's not something a lot of watch companies do. It absolutely makes it feel like a step up from the other watches below this price range. And bringing my other Nomos in here just really quickly, what I really like about the club range is how much depth they pack into that dial. Looking at the Tetra here, it is by comparison very flat. There isn't a lot of depth to the printing. You do get some extra little areas of like the sub-seconds which sinks in just like it does here, and that cut out of the power reserve, but the rest of the dial is relatively boring, I guess you could say. The color is really what brings it to life. Whereas this, you can tell that the numerals have a three-dimensional quality to it. You can tell, because the sub-seconds is so much bigger, that it really sinks into the dial and adds this unique visual ring along the outside. So it's just these small little aspects that take this from a good watch to a great watch in a sense. Looking at the watch from the side view, as you can see, literally melts into the wrist. It does not really rise up at all. You will have no problem fitting this under a dress cuff, or unless, again, this may be too long and it's gonna get in the way of just the sleeve closing in general. But as long as you have a wrist similar to my size, you should be fine. And then one thing to note is I am on the second to last hole on the stock gray suede Nomos strap, which is really great quality, feels good, color tone wise I think matches really well. But even though I'm pretty much at the end of the strap, I don't have a lot of overhang of that end of the strap. At some angles, it doesn't look like I have overhang at all. So if you have a 6.75, 7-inch wrist, you're not gonna have any overhang on that watch strap, and it's gonna look really good, really uniform, really just like one piece of strap rather than something that, to me, looks odd. When you have too much strap overhang, to me, it doesn't look great on a watch when it almost just looks like a band of color, and then the watch, it looks really cohesive. I do think this watch works perfectly on one-piece straps because it gets rid of that lug gap and it makes it feel a lot shorter, surprisingly, as long as it still wears well on your wrist. So here we have this, I believe it's wrist and style. I'll have a link down below for all the straps. Just simple generic Perlon in this kind of creamish color, sandy color that I think pairs perfectly with this orange tone of the dial. What's great in my opinion about adding a Perlon to a dress watch is the fact that, one, they're very thin, so it doesn't really add any height at all, but two, it adds this cool little textural feel to the watch itself. It gives a unique point of interest, a point of visual interest to the watch that otherwise wouldn't be there, and I like it. I think you can kind of tell what I mean by when you put it on a one-piece strap, it doesn't feel as odd in a case shape because, again, there is no lug gap. It just feels cohesive. It feels like one piece of watch now, in a sense. It's integrated now. And if I move my watch up on my wrist a little bit, I do have closer to a 6-inch wrist here, and it's still not overhanging, it's still not too big, so this watch will fit a variety of wrist sizes as well. Next we have this silicone strap from Benchmark Straps, this beautiful blue tone that I think pairs well with the orange, and another benefit is too, again, this is a thinner one-piece strap, so it doesn't really add any height at all to the watch. You do have that 100 meters of water resistance, so basically you can take the strap in the water with you, which is a nice benefit, and yeah, I just think it's a really cool combo, not too expensive, and it gets rid of that lug gap, so I think it's cool. There we have the silicone strap. Again, plants it amazingly well, gets rid of that lug gap, makes the case feel less awkward. That beautiful blue tone doesn't overpower the dial, it really just complements the color and doesn't draw too much attention to itself, but doesn't make it too bland in my opinion, or too blendy like the gray suede strap does. So beautiful combo here, and I think if you have this watch, you should try it out. Next, to take the brightness of the watch up to infinity, you have this bright orange silicone strap from Archer Straps. I like it because it really plays off the orange of the sub-seconds hand, obviously color tone wise mixes in, and again, it's probably the most obnoxious, loud, fun combo you can go for, so, you know, it is what it is. If you like it, you like it. If you don't have to wear it. Most of the time, I'm not the biggest fan of orange. It's not a color tone that I typically like to wear or like to kind of go with, but in this variation, I'd probably wear it once or twice. And lastly, the white Archer silicone strap for if you want the tame brother of the last strap. Obviously, perfect combo, summery, but not in your face like the other one quite as much. Lets the dial shine a lot more, and is just a beautiful tone-on-tone feel in my opinion. Even though it doesn't perfectly match the color tone of the numerals, to me it still looks really good. It still matches close enough and doesn't look overly mismatched in person. And yeah, really comfortable combo, and this is the one that I wore it on kind of the most. So taking a look at the Lume here, and it's not a bad application. Everything's very visible. You can read the time very well. The seconds hand isn't loomed at all, but everything is visible and glows brightly. It just doesn't last forever. So I do think they can do a better job in that sense. Reluming and comparing to the Timex, similar color temperature, similar brightness, but at the end of the day, again, I think the Nomos just die a little quickly, so they can just add a couple more layers to it, and it would look amazing. So pros and cons of this club campus, and one of the biggest pros for me, and the same almost applies to every Nomos, is just how thin they are. I don't know if you can really, capture that on camera, but again, it's just such a thin watch. They use the manual wind movements, even their automatics are very thin, and they somehow still pack 100 meters of water resistance in there. To me, and maybe this may be an error on my part or an assumption on my part, is that really thinness is something you don't get until you get to very high-end watches, very typically at least, and especially if you're continuing to have 100 meters of water resistance. It's not something you see going hand in hand very often. So the fact that you get this form factor from Nomos, the fact that it is so comfortable, and the price point it's coming at, it's nice. Another big pro for me just will be the dial quality. I love this club campus and just the club range in general because they have this thicker printing, they have the beautiful numerals, they're not as stark and sparse as some of the other Nomos models, and it just feels right. It feels good for the money. I also just think the dial base texture is done really well. That color, that kind of speckled, painted look, feel to it, it just doesn't reflect too much. It's not too bright, it's not too shiny, but it has really good deep color saturation. It doesn't feel overblown in certain lights. It's very consistent with its color appearance no matter what lighting you're in, and it looks good. Now moving on to my last pro, and it kind of was sprinkled out throughout the other points, is the fact that this is, I think, good value. You're paying about $1,500, at least for the closed case back version, and you're getting an amazingly thin watch, you're getting good water resistance, you're getting a good printed dial, you're getting a fairly reliable movement, and there's not really much more you can ask for. Yes, we can have some tweaks to the case. Yes, you can maybe want something more sporty, but in essence, this can do anything you want. Maybe not in some of these super bright colors, which are not as versatile, but if you go for one of these more versatile colors, it can be a one watch that can be dressed up, can be dressed down, can go to the pool, can be worn in a suit because of how thin it is. There really isn't a watch that comes to mind that looks this way, offers the same specs, and executes it as well for anywhere around this price point. So I think Nomos definitely hits the ball out of the park with this club range. Moving on to cons, because there's always some, and for me, it's mainly the fact that the case still is just a little bit too long. The lugs are very defined. It's odd because the side profile, if you're just looking at the watch from the side, it looks good. The lugs don't look too insane, but it's really that top view where it really becomes a little bit too long, a little bit too prominent. And I think the main issue is that it really does create a lug gap between the strap and the case. If they would just shorten it enough, or even maybe even possibly move the lug holes of the watch closer to the case so that there is no lug gap, it would be a better wearing experience in my opinion. That's why when I typically own any of these club models like I do currently, I wear it on one-piece straps because it gets rid of that lug gap, it makes it feel more cohesive, and it doesn't make the lug stand out as much. My next con for the watch, and it's really minor, I just think the lume could be better. I think there's just so many benefits that can be added by doing better lume to the watch. If they're applying more layers of superluminova, they make the markers thicker, they add more depth to the dial, it will just look more premium in my opinion, and then it will glow better. So there is really no downside to doing that other than the fact that maybe you'll raise the price of the watch, but even then it's like, if you had to raise it by $50 to make better lume and make the dial more present and more powerful, do it. And last but not least, and this is kind of almost I wouldn't say it's a problem of this exact model in particular, but it does happen throughout the club range, is they pick interesting accent colors. Like you saw with this model, there is an outline of each numeral in this blue tone. I don't think it works perfectly on the dial. It's not something you always notice. It's not glaring, it's not obvious, it's not super in your face, but it's one of those things where like once you notice it, it's hard to not. And it's one of those really weird things too, because with this green model, it's outlined in almost the exact same green as the dial around the numerals. They didn't go for a contrasting color, so I don't know why that's an inconsistency within this range, especially when these two colors were released together. It's an odd choice, but I'm sure they have their reasons. I just don't love it. You may. So final thoughts on this watch, and I've always loved the Club Campus range. The Club was one of my first luxury watches in a sense, and it kind of almost holds a special place in my heart because of that. It offers great value. I think most people would agree on that fact. You're getting a completely in-house made movement. You're getting a case made by Nomos. This is a really good display of watchmaking at that price point. If you go for the sapphire case back, you see a relatively pretty movement. You can even order the closed case back and upgrade to the sapphire later, which is fun because then you discover a new part of your watch after having owned it for a while. The dial quality and the printing of this watch and the depth that you get from the sub-seconds and the rest of it, just the execution of the dial really, is some of Nomos's best in my opinion, and it's amazing that you get it on their entry-level piece. Do I think this is a watch for everyone? Probably not. It leans a little bit dressy, which I love. Maybe it leans a little less dressy if you go for one of the fun colors and it becomes sporty in that sense, but it's not gonna feel like a sports watch. It's not going to be maybe a size that people love, especially the 36 or the 38, because if you step up to the 38, the lugs are even longer on that one. If you like presence on your wrist, you'll definitely get it with that watch. But I would also say if you can try these on, try to size down because again, one, they wear bigger than you would expect, and two, because it leans dressier, it's just a classy look to size down slightly if it fits your wrist and your proportions. The thing about this range from Nomos is I don't think there's a lot of direct competitors, and I think Nomos really has a winner on their hands. If this aesthetic appeals to you, if the dial color appeals to you, if the value appeals to you, if owning a German watch appeals to you, there's just so many things going for this watch that I'm sure there's a reason you can find to want it. I think there's a reason you can find to justify it. I think it's going to be a watch you enjoy as long as you can get over its few little quirks. Even someone like me who's almost been vehemently against this lug gap from the very beginning of the range, having owned probably 5 of the clubs at this point, I still can't get over how much I like the watch. There's a reason I bought 5 of them, right? I've made my peace within the sense of like, yes, maybe it's only belongs on one-piece straps, at least in my collection, but I have other watches that aren't on one-piece straps. So you have variety for a reason, and this watch provides me things that I enjoy, and I think it can do the same for you. Anyway, those are just my thoughts, my little ramblings. And again, let me know if you want to see a little bit of a 5, 6, 7-ish minute, however long it ends up being, a quick look review of this watch, and I'll probably do it. Other than that, Thank you as always for watching. Hope you got something out of it, and I'll see you in another one.